Hi, friends, and welcome back to Hot Air with me, Joshua Robert. This is a podcast where we blow up the news, we filter out the nonsense, and we talk about the stuff that just makes you go like, wait, what the fuck is going on? And if you're on YouTube and you're wondering, where is my face? Today, you're not going to see it because the holidays have been crazy busy. I am traveling and I am doing this kind of on the go, but we'll be back to the visuals next week. But I do hope that everyone had a great holiday. If you do celebrate Christmas or whatever holiday it is that you celebrate, I hope you enjoyed it. And because Jesus' birthday is now gone, we're going to move back to our bullshit. I'm back on my bullshit, okay? So today we've got a triple shot of headlines that are equal parts wild, infuriating, and absolutely headline worthy. We're talking about Congress passing Marjorie Taylor Greene's anti-trans bill that could criminalize gender-affirming care for kids, Japan continuing to be the only G7 country that does not allow same-sex marriage, and a Michigan high school volleyball game that somehow went viral because a trans athlete played in the game. Oh God, what is going on? I miss the days when I was just talking about the Bible and Jesus. It's a lot, it's messy, and we're just here to unpack it all. But before we dive in, quick housekeeping. If you like what you hear, make sure you're following me on social media, on Instagram and TikTok at _hotairpod for that extra hot air content. Shop my merch on my website, submit your listener stories there, and topic suggestions, hotairwithjoshuarobert.com. I want to hear what you are thinking about, what you're outraged about, or just can't believe is happening in the world. Speak up. Your voice is part of this show, so do not be shy. All right. Strap in. Put your strap on because these headlines are about to get dissected, served with a side of snark, and topped off with a sprinkle of just WTF. So let's hit it. Let's just jump right into the colossal political banana peel of the week, okay? Congress is still handing out surprises that are wrapped in legislative tissue paper and very bad optics. So on December 17th, I was going to say 2025, obviously 2025, the U.S. House of Representatives passed an extreme bill that would literally make it a federal felony to provide gender-affirming care for transgender youth. Meaning doctors, healthcare providers, and potentially even parents could face up to 10 years in prison for offering or assisting with puberty blockers, hormone treatments, or surgeries for people under 18. Yes, you did hear that right. Criminal charges for really doing your job or for being a supportive caregiver. This isn't some distant state legislature that we are talking about here. We're talking about the full U.S. House of Representatives. Now, the bill has the catchy title, Protect Children's Innocence Act, a name that sounds like the title of a Hallmark movie, quite frankly, where puppies learn to skateboard by the end, which kind of would be cute, not a proposal to toss medical professionals in the slammer. I wouldn't even make that up if I wanted to parody it, okay? The language in the bill, as reported, calls gender-affirming care things like mutilation and castration, terms that are obviously dramatic, that are loaded, and medically inaccurate. Steven Spielberg couldn't write a villain with words that over the top. And this is a really big deal. Historically, efforts to limit gender-affirming care have mostly lived at the state level, in red states that have passed laws restricting access or penalizing providers. But this is the first time a federal ban with felony provisions has passed a chamber of Congress. That is a huge escalation. So how did this circus get passed? Let's talk numbers for a second because the math is spicy. The bill passed the House 216 to 211, pretty razor-thin margins. And here's where the plot thickens. 3 Democrats voted in favor of it. You heard that right again. Not just Republicans here. Democratic representatives broke with their party on this. That crossover gave the bill the majority it needed in the House. Those three Democratic representatives are Vincent Gonzalez and Henry, I'm going to say Cuellar, but I know I'm saying that wrong, from Texas, and Don Davis from North Carolina. Now, I have to pause here for a sanity check. At least 3 elected Democrats agreed to vote for a bill that would criminalize the medical care of transgender youth and put real, living doctors in danger of federal prosecution. This is not theoretical. It's not hyperbole. It's up to a decade in prison for prescribing puberty blockers to a minor. Even helping a teen access telehealth across state lines could count as a crime. That's what is literally in these provisions. And let's be really clear about the context here. These treatments, like puberty blockers and hormone therapy, are standard medical options used in carefully considered, evidence-based care for transgender adolescents. They are supported by the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, groups that literally wrote the textbooks most doctors use. They've said this legislation is not only harmful, but dangerous to young people's mental health and well-being. The bill also doesn't just stop at care itself. It clamps down on Medicaid funding, bans federal health plans from covering gender-affirming healthcare, and even would force medical schools to avoid teaching about it. Some news coverage even noted it would block anyone who performs gender-affirming procedures from immigrating to the United States. That's like if your kid gets a bad sunburn and then someone proposes banning dermatologists from visiting the country. I mean, like, where is this ending? Which leads me to question, what is the rationale from the supporters? Marjorie Taylor Greene herself calls this moral armor. She claims, as she frequently does, that this is about protecting children. That's what they all fucking claim, really. Her framing is that these treatments are harmful, that they are somehow irreversible mutilation performed on kids who cannot consent. That's the talking point, anyway. There's even reporting that Greene tied the vote directly to the broader congressional bills like the National Defense Authorization Act. In other words, she made a deal with party leadership. You let me have my day in the sun and a vote, and I'll help you get crucial funding and defense policy through. Politics, right? That's how it works. But the critics, from medical professionals, from LGBTQ plus advocacy groups, from parents of trans kids, have a completely different take. They are calling the bill cruel, harmful, and rooted in ideology rather than science. Mike Zamore from the ACLU said this bill puts ill-equipped politicians between families and their doctors. And I mean, frankly, I agree. And that's exactly the crux of the concern. This would remove expert judgment from individual healthcare decisions. And look, the mental health implications of these kinds of laws aren't theoretical either. Numerous studies and medical groups have documented that access to affirming care for trans youth can significantly reduce anxiety, depression, and suicide risk, something I have said so many times, and I'm not really sure why people continue to ignore the facts. And conversely, restricting that care often increases distress, something advocates warn could be replicated on a national level if this even gets close to becoming law. States that have passed bans have already seen families scramble for care out of state, and some have left their home states entirely just to get medical support for their children. So where does this bill go now? At the moment, the Senate is the next hurdle, and the same fissures that make this controversial in the House are going to be even more so in the Senate. Most observers expect this bill will not clear the Senate, largely because it needs 60 votes to overcome a filibuster, and because even some Republicans in the chamber have balked at pushing such an extreme federal penalty. So while passing the House is historic, at least in terms of legislative escalation, it's not law yet, not by a long shot. But even if it stalls, the symbolism here matters. It signals how energized the anti-trans legislative movement is and how lawmakers are willing to escalate to federal levels. It's wild. It also raises questions about why members of both parties would support this kind of bill, especially Democrats who represent districts that aren't even close to overwhelmingly conservative. It's the kind of political puzzle that keeps analysis up at night, keeps me up at night, actually, and community members up in anger and fear. And look, I want to be clear. You don't have to be a political junkie to see how surreal, quite surreal, this entire thing is. Turning medical care into a federal crime? That's not health policy. That's criminal justice policy applied to health care. This is the kind of overreach that looks like someone said, healthcare wasn't dramatic enough. How about we add jail time? And when someone else replied, great idea, let's make it national, they all just jumped on the bandwagon. So this is real. This is happening. And it's not happening in some fringe committee. It's happening on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. So between the House vote, the 3 Democrats who broke ranks, the potential felony consequences for doctors and parents, and the near universal condemnation for medical professionals, that is a lot to process in 1 week's news cycle. And again, I want it to be Jesus' birthday again because this is back to the deep business. But I guess that's what Hot Air is here for, right? To take the headlines that shock us and help us kind of make sense of them with a little bit of context. And from here in the United States, we're going to move on to something international. We're going to Japan. And I'm going to Japan in February. And quite literally, like a week after I booked my plane tickets and all my hotels and whatever, all the things, everything was paid for, non-refundable, mind you. I saw this big news article about how Japan doesn't even allow same-sex marriage. And I was like, damn. But I'm still going, so we'll see what happens. But let's talk about a story that is incredibly timely and also deeply frustrating because while a lot of the world has moved forward, one major player seems stuck in traffic with their hazard lights on. I'm talking about Japan. I already said I'm talking about Japan, but just in case you didn't get it, I'm talking about Japan. A global economic powerhouse, a cultural trendsetter in everything from anime to sushi to airport fashion. And yet, when it comes to legal recognition of same-sex marriage, it remains the only G7 country that doesn't offer full marriage equality. And that's right. Every other group of 7 industrialized democracy recognizes marriage for same-sex couples. The US, Canada, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan stands alone. Now, you might hear that and think, wait, like what? Are you sure? And yes, I double, triple, quadruple check. Japan is literally the odd one out in the world's wealthiest club of nations when it comes to marriage equality. So let's unpack what's going on because this is one of those issues where legal progress, cultural sentiment, and political hesitation are doing this weird synchronized swim routine that keeps landing face first into the shallow end. The most recent and headline-grabbing development happened in late November of 2025, when the Tokyo High Court ruled that Japan's ban on same-sex marriage is constitutional. A judge named Ayumi Higashi wrote that the existing civil code, which limits marriage to a man and a woman, does not violate the Japanese constitution and rejected a claim for damages by plaintiffs who had sought compensation for being denied the basic right to wed. That ruling effectively upheld the status quo and delivered what advocates called a major blow to marriage equality efforts. Activists were understandably incensed. One plaintiff named Hiromi responded to the ruling by saying she was not just sad, but outraged and appalled. She asked the question a lot of people feel, were the judges even listening to us? But here's where the story gets a little bit weird, and not just weird in the fun anime sense. Japan's legal landscape has actually seen a patchwork of judicial opinions on the issue. 5 out of 6 high courts in Japan have found that the lack of legal same-sex marriage is unconstitutional, citing violations of basic equality provisions in the Constitution. So yeah, 5. 5 out of 6, and yet 1, the Tokyo High Court, ended up being the lone holdout, essentially giving the government judicial cover to keep things the way they are. So on one hand, you've got a symphony of rulings saying the law discriminates, and on the other, you've got the Tokyo court saying, nah, we're good, no thank you. I was going to say no gracias, but that's Spanish. Cue the legal schizophrenia here. It's pretty crazy. It's like if 5 referees in a basketball game signaled a 3-pointer and one ref just shrugged and said, I don't see it. And everyone still waits to see what the Supreme Court will do. And why I used like a basketball analogy there, I don't know. Probably because ChatGPT told me to, okay? Don't come for me. But here's one more twist. Even though nationwide marriage equality has not been passed, Japan has made some piecemeal moves towards recognizing same sex couples. The national legislature has passed laws aimed at promoting, understanding, and preventing discrimination against sexual orientation and gender identity. That's a mouthful, clearly. If you couldn't tell, I was struggling to spit that out. But essentially, it means various levels of government and public institutions are supposed to foster tolerance and prevent unfair treatment of LGBTQ plus people. So that is a plus. At the local level, too, many municipal governments across Japan offer what are called partnership certificates to same-sex couples. These certificates don't give full legal marriage rights like tax treatment, pension benefits, or adoption rights, but they do provide some level of formal recognition and can help with things like hospital visitations and housing. They're meaningful, but they're also kind of like giving someone a box of juice when they asked for a wedding cake. Like, it still is not doing the job. So why isn't Japan moving forward with full marriage equality when most of the world already has? Here's some of the bigger things that you need to know. First, culture and tradition still exert huge influence. There's a strong sentiment in Japanese society around the idea of family being a man and a woman with children, a traditional framework that the legal code has reflected for decades. The Constitution itself, written and adopted after World War II, speaks of marriage as based on mutual consent of both sexes, which some interpret as not including same-sex couples without revision or reinterpretation. Second, politics make compromise very hard. Conservative forces in Japanese politics, particularly the long-dominating Liberal Democratic Party, have been reluctant to push marriage reform. Even when there's broader societal support building, and recent polls have shown that majority of Japanese citizens favor marriage equality, the political machine moves like a train in traffic. And there's also influence from more nationalist or right-leaning parties who campaigned against same-sex marriage in recent elections. And third, and this one's a little extra for you, the judicial system itself is doing some strange deja vu of back and forth weirdness. Over the last few years, courts in Sapporo, Osaka, Nagoya, Fukuoka, again, you know me, probably saying that wrong, and even other Tokyo courts have weighed in with rulings that find the ban unconstitutional. But most don't grant damages to plaintiffs, meaning that, yes, they say the practice violates legal equality, but they stop short of ordering the government to do anything about it. And then the Tokyo High Court goes the other way on constitutionality entirely. It's like a legal remix where no version is fully definitive and may never be. From a big picture perspective, this has created a lot of pressure on national politicians to act. Activists point out that Japan's current stance isn't just symbolic. The lack of marriage equality has a real consequence for same-sex couples every day. From inheritance rights to tax filing to the ability to register as the next of kin in hospitals, these are not fringe inconveniences. They affect people's lives deeply. And there's a generational component to it too. Younger Japanese tend to be more supportive of LGBTQ plus equality than older generations, a pattern we see all over the entire world. But politics tends to cater to older voters who turn out more consistently. So while public opinion shifts, political action lags way behind. Internationally, human rights groups like Amnesty International have condemned the Tokyo court's decision and urged the Japanese government to take legislative action to catch up to global standards. They've called the ruling a significant step backwards and emphasized that discrimination against same-sex couples must be addressed through clear legal reform, not just judicial back and forth. BS, we know how it goes. So right now, the movement for marriage equality in Japan feels a bit like watching a game that's stuck in extra innings. Why am I talking about sports again? Who am I? I'm going to need to talk to ChatGPT after this and be like, can we please not include any more sports references? Thank you. The scoreboard keeps showing conflicting signals. Some judges say the law is unconstitutional. Others disagree. Local governments give partial recognition. National governments say maybe later. And the public watches, hopeful but frustrated. and I think we can all get on board with that. It seems like politics all over the world are just pissing off the citizens. So if you're asking, where does Japan go from here? The short answer is it's complicated. There's legal momentum in some corners, social support growing among the population, and international pressure mounting. But without a clear majority in the national legislature willing to rewrite the marriage laws or even clarify the constitution, the status quo could endure far longer than advocates would like. So, in other words, Japan may be a tech juggernaut and host of the best convenience store snacks on earth, so I've been told, but marriage equality policy moves slower than a bullet train stuck behind a sightseeing tour bus. Although I don't know why a tour bus would be on the same track as a sightseeing train, but if that was a possibility, I imagine the train wouldn't be going very fast. And that's the story with Japan and same-sex marriage right now. Culturally rich, politically polarized, legally tangled, and still waiting for that breakthrough moment that would finally make it join the rest of its G7 peers in guaranteeing equal marriage rights under the law. And side note, when I'm going to Japan, I have a lot of tattoos on my arms. And there's these things called onsens, I think. Who knows? I'll find out. They're hot springs. And I didn't know that you couldn't show your tattoos. I didn't realize that Japan was so, what's the word I'm looking for? Modest? Maybe modest is the word I'm looking for. There's another word, but it's not coming to my mind. I had no idea. My ass was about to walk into those hot springs with my tattoos flaring about, but I'm glad I know now. But I always thought of Japan as being very progressive and very ahead of the times, but it's very interesting to learn that not always what you think is true. All right, let's get into the third story, and fair warning, this one is a masterclass in how a single high school volleyball game somehow turned into a full-blown national culture war, complete with cable news, crazies, right-wing outrage cycles, and one very determined dad who decided his daughter's loss needed a federal investigation. Talk about a poor loser. This story starts in Michigan at a pretty ordinary high school girls volleyball match. No riot police, no dramatic halftime monologue, just teenage athletes, knee pads, loud parents, and that one ref that everyone side-eyes. Sports is the theme for today's episode, but at least this is like legit sports. One of the teams allegedly had a transgender girl playing. Emphasis on allegedly, because even that detail has been contested and muddled as the story has spread. But what is clear is that after the match, a parent named Sean Lechner, whose daughter is cisgender, filed a Title IX complaint, claiming that allowing a trans girl to compete constituted discrimination against female athletes and called for a ban on what he repeatedly described as biological males in women's sports. And if you're already exhausted by that phrasing, same, but we should be used to this bullshit by now. So before we even get to the complaint, let's talk about how quickly this escalated. Within days, this story was everywhere. Fox News, Newsmax, conservative blogs, very conservative social media threads, filled with grainy screenshots and speculative commentary. Obviously, very right-wing people just jumped on that bandwagon, took this and ran with it. And it became less about one volleyball game and more about everything else: fairness, gender, science, schools, parents' rights, and the idea that trans kids are somehow storming athletic fields like it's the fucking Hunger Games. Are you kidding me? Suddenly, a local sports dispute was being framed as proof that Title IX itself was under attack. Sean Lechner's complaint argued that allowing trans girls to compete violates the intent of Title IX, which was designed to protect women's sports. He claimed his daughter was placed at a competitive disadvantage and that schools were prioritizing inclusion over fairness. This framing has become incredibly familiar, and that's not an accident. It's the same language we've seen repeated in state legislatures, court cases, and political campaigns across the country. It's simple, emotionally charged, and it travels very well on cable news. But here's the thing that keeps getting lost. Title IX does not require blanket bans on transgender athletes. In fact, Title IX has been interpreted for decades to prohibit discrimination. And more recently, that includes discrimination based on gender identity. The Biden administration's guidance clarified that schools receiving federal funding cannot categorically exclude trans students from participating in school activities that are consistent with their gender identity. That guidance is currently being challenged in court, but it's very much part of the legal landscape right now. And also, and this part matters, high school sports are governed by state athletic associations, not Fox News panels. In Michigan, the Michigan High School Athletic Association has had policies in place for years allowing transgender students to participate under specific guidelines. These policies typically include reviews of medical history, hormone treatment timelines, and eligibility standards. This is not any kid can show up tomorrow and dominate women's sports, despite what certain pundits and motherfuckers would like for you to believe. I was so professional and so calm for a while there, but now I'm just irritated. But once this story went viral, Nuance packed its bags and left the chat, okay? Right-wing media framed the incident as a crisis, often without confirming whether the athlete in question was even transgender, nor what policies were followed or whether there was any actual competitive imbalance here. What if the apparent trans athlete was 5'2" and 20 pounds lighter than his daughter? Would he still be mad? Probably not. Headlines screamed about boys stealing girls' sports. Commentators called it proof that schools had lost control, and suddenly, Sean Lechner was being interviewed as a brave whistleblower that was standing up to wokeness. And look, I want to pause here and say something very important. Parents are allowed to advocate for their kids, right? Full stop. Filing a complaint doesn't make someone a villain. But when that advocacy turns into a national moral panic yet again, aimed at a marginalized group, especially minors, because these kids are in high school, we have to talk about the consequences. Because while adults argue on TV, there is a real student, a real human being who is underage at the center of this, a teenager, a kid who went to volleyball practice and ended up at the center of a national debate about whether she deserves to exist in public spaces. Can you imagine how terrible that would feel? Trans youth already face higher risks of anxiety, depression, bullying, and suicide risk. Now imagine your name or even just your school becoming shorthand for a culture war talking point. Again, that's not theoretical harm, that's lived experience, and that is what is happening right now. But the science of it is far less settled than cable news would suggest. Major medical organizations, again, including the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Medical Association, have consistently said that participation decisions should be individualized based on factors like age, level of competition, and hormone treatment rather than blanket bans. High school sports are not the Olympics. They are not the NCAA championships. They are developmental educational activities. But that does not stop the narrative machine. The story quickly became about protecting girls, even though no evidence has emerged that the athlete in question dominated the game, caused injuries, or violated existing rules. There were no reports of broken records, unsafe play, or overwhelming advantage. Just a loss, followed by a complaint, followed by a media explosion. And that's where the story really lives, not in the gymnasium, but in the way loss and discomfort are being weaponized. Again, poor ass loser, because sports involve losing. Hello, we know this. Somebody's got to lose. Not everyone can't win. Sometimes you lose because the other team played better. Sometimes because your serves were off. Sometimes because a ref made a bad call. And sometimes, especially at the high school level, because teenagers are unpredictable and chaotic and puberty is weird for everyone. One day you're on your game, the next you're not. But when a trans athlete is involved, losing suddenly becomes evidence of systemic injustice. The Title IX complaint is still under review, and no ruling has been made banning the athlete or changing Michigan's policies. But that hasn't stopped politicians from citing the case as justification for broader bans or media outlets from using it to stoke fear. It's become another brick in the wall of anti-trans sport legislation that's sweeping across the country, often without regard for how few trans athletes actually exist. We're talking about a population that makes up a tiny fraction of student athletes, yet somehow they're framed as an existential crisis, a giant ass threat to girls' sports. And what really gets me is this. If the goal were truly to protect girls' sports, we'd be talking about funding inequities, access to facilities, coaching disparities, and pay gaps. We'd be talking about how many girls' programs get cut before boys' programs do. We'd be talking about safety, resources, and opportunity. But instead, we're talking about one kid who may or may not be transgender. One kid, one game, one complaint, national outrage. This story isn't really about volleyball. It's about how quickly trans people, especially trans youth, become symbols instead of humans. It's about how Title IX, a law meant to expand opportunity, is being reframed as a tool for exclusion. And it's about how outrage travels faster than facts, especially when it fits neatly into a political narrative that we're learning the right fucking loves. So where does this leave us? Right now, the complaint exists. The media storm continues, and trans students across the country are watching closely. The very small amount of trans students across the country, because they make up such a small percentage of the population. They're wondering if their next game, their next meet or match is going to make them the next headline, because that's the real impact, not just policy, but fear. Fear of showing up, fear of being seen, fear of being blamed for something as ordinary as a win or a loss. And truly, that's what they want. The people in charge is fear. And that's the part that we all should sit with, because sports are supposed to teach teamwork and resilience and respect. And honestly, they're supposed to be fun. What they shouldn't teach kids is that their existence is negotiable, or that adults will turn them into political props the moment it's convenient. That's the hot air swirling around this story. And unfortunately, it's not dissipating anytime soon. Oh, I'm winded. Could you tell I'm winded? Honestly, I had a really hard time talking by the end of the episode here. The holidays have me worn out, people, but that is a wrap on today's episode of Hot Air Whirlwind, let me tell you. Congress trying to criminalize care for trans kids, Japan still dragging its feet on marriage equality, and one high school volleyball game that somehow became a national firestorm. If there's one takeaway, it's that the world keeps finding new ways to surprise, frustrate, and occasionally make us laugh at the absurdity of it all. And sometimes we laugh at all three of the things we talked about today and then maybe go cry on my pillow later. Don't forget to follow me on social media, on Instagram and TikTok @_hotairpod. Check out my merch on my website. Share your personal stories, topic suggestions on my website as well, hotairwithjoshuarobert.com, because the conversation doesn't end here. I love hearing from you all. So thank you for tuning in, keeping your eyes open, and keeping the hot air blowing, okay? Keep blowing, baby. Keep blowing. I'm going to come back, obviously, with another episode next week. We're going to be wrapping up 2025. I'm excited for this episode. It's going to be a fun little wrap up, a little look back, a little bit of a how to end the year on a positive note and start the next year on an even better one. You know, New Year's resolutions. I live for them, okay? So again, thanks for listening. I'm Josh, and I will see you next Tuesday.